My name is Alex Carter. I'm 32. The last time my father and I spoke, he declared I would never be anything more than a glorified clerk pushing papers in some forgotten government basement. That conversation took place 3 years ago, at my grandmother's funeral, where he announced to our entire family that his son had foolishly squandered his potential by playing spy games instead of pursuing the law career he had meticulously planned for me. What he was unaware of, what all of them were unaware of, was that just 2 weeks earlier, I had been personally briefed by the Director of National Intelligence on a clandestine operation poised to redefine intelligence frameworks across the Middle East. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning as I was analyzing surveillance summaries in my office at Fort Meade. My cousin Mark's voice was strained, thick with a panic he was failing to conceal. "Alex, you've got to get home. Now." "What's wrong?" "It's your dad. He's been arrested." The words felt like a physical shock. My father, Colonel David Carter, retired. The very man who had spent my youth instilling in me the values of discipline and honor, the man who had effectively cut me off for selecting military intelligence over law school, was now in a federal holding facility in El Paso, facing charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. "That's not possible," I stated. Yet, as the denial left my lips, disparate facts began to coalesce into a disturbing picture. His unexplained affluence following retirement, the new estate, the high-end vehicles, his travels to nations that should have been off-limits for any man with his service record. "Alex, you have to do something," Mark pleaded. "You're in government, aren't you? Can't you pull some strings?" I shut my eyes. If only he had any idea what kind of strings I could pull. "I'll be on the next flight." The journey to El Paso afforded me 12 hours to process and 12 hours to reflect on why I had maintained my distance for so long. My father had been an exemplary officer, a figure I had idolized throughout my childhood. But when I opted to follow his path, though in the intelligence sphere rather than combat arms, he perceived it as a personal betrayal of his ambitions for me. "You're squandering your intellect," he had remarked upon my graduation from West Point. Intelligence analysis. That's a job for men who can't lead from the front. When I was promoted to captain at 26, he offered a tepid congratulations. When I earned my first commendation for an operation I couldn't even describe to him, he deflected the conversation. And when I finally achieved the rank of major and attempted to share my accomplishment with him, his expression bordered on disgust. 30 years old and you're still just a staff officer. When are you going to step up and command your own life? That was our last meaningful exchange before the incident at the funeral. He had presented me to distant relatives as my son, who has a desk job in the Army. When I attempted to clarify that my role was more significant, he dismissed me with a gesture of clear embarrassment. "Alex, please. We all know you're not exactly a rising star over there." If only he knew that 3 months prior, I had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a joint task force overseeing counterintelligence activities in 7 different countries. If only he knew that U.S. senators sought my briefings, that 4-star generals valued my strategic assessments, and that my security clearance was so high, most of my own family couldn't legally know the location of my workplace. But I never corrected him, partially due to classification protocols, but primarily because his constant disapproval had wounded me so deeply that I had given up seeking his validation. The federal courthouse in El Paso was an imposing structure of marble and glass, radiating institutional authority. I had been in similar buildings before, but always as the one providing the briefing, never as an individual whose private life had become entangled with the federal justice system. My family was clustered in the lobby, looking like the dazed survivors of some disaster. Mark was present with his wife, along with my Aunt Clara, my Uncle Robert, and a few cousins I barely knew. Their gazes turned to me as I entered, and I recognized the familiar blend of desperation and condescension in their eyes. "Alex," Mark said, rushing to my side. "Thank God. Did you get in touch with someone from your office? Someone who can fix this?" "I brought myself." Uncle Robert stepped up. "Mijo, with all due respect, we need someone with actual influence here. Someone who can get something done." "Like who?" "Someone who understands the system, who has connections." "You're in intelligence, you said? Can't you call your superior?" I nearly let a smile slip. "Let me see what I can ascertain first." The reality was, I had already made my calls during a layover in Dallas. Not to my superior, I was the head of my own division, but to counterparts at the Department of Justice, the State Department, and agencies whose very existence I couldn't acknowledge in that company. My father's case file was already on my desk back in Maryland. It had been for the past 6 months. I had been the one to personally sign off on the surveillance that culminated in his arrest. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. We waited for 4 hours. 4 hours of my family members pacing, whispering theories, and occasionally remembering to ask about my little government job, with the kind of forced politeness one uses for a nephew's peculiar hobby. Mark's husband was constantly on his phone, muttering about legal fees. Aunt Clara clutched her rosary beads. Uncle Robert proclaimed to anyone within earshot that it was all a grave error, that David Carter was a patriot who had served his country for 30 years. He would never betray America, he repeated. This is a witch hunt. I remained silent, knowing the truth. The evidence was irrefutable. Financial statements, intercepted communications, records of meetings with foreign agents, and classified materials discovered in his study. My father hadn't just betrayed his nation. He had done so with a sloppy arrogance, as if his decorated past would grant him immunity. At 4:30, a federal prosecutor named Jonathan Walsh stepped out of the elevator, his eyes scanning the lobby until they locked on me. "Mr. Carter, a word with you, in private." My family grew tense. Mark took my arm. "Should we join you?" "No," Walsh stated flatly. "Just Mr. Carter." He led me to a small conference room, closed the door, and faced me with an unreadable expression. "This is extremely unorthodox," he started, "but considering your position, I wanted to speak with you before the arraignment." "My position?" "Colonel Carter, please. We both understand why you're really here." The rank landed in the room with tangible force. No one in my family's presence had called me colonel since my promotion 8 months prior. Classification rules meant I was officially a lieutenant colonel for most administrative purposes. But my operational rank was full colonel, and my authority was far more extensive than most could comprehend. "What do you need?" I asked. "Were you aware of your father's activities?" "Not until my division flagged financial irregularities 6 months ago. I removed myself from the operational oversight once we confirmed his identity. But you gave no warning." It was a statement, not a question. We both knew I couldn't have, even if I'd been so inclined. But the reality was more complex. "No," I answered softly. "I didn't." Walsh nodded, opening a folder. "The case is airtight. Bank records indicate payments of $3 million over an 18-month period. We have surveillance photos, recorded calls, and classified intelligence recovered from his home. He's facing significant prison time, Colonel. The only variable is the length of the sentence. What are you asking of me? Nothing. I'm informing you that in approximately 20 minutes, your father will be arraigned on charges that could lead to a life sentence. Your family will be shattered, and you will have to choose whether to reveal who you truly are or continue to let them believe you're a low-level functionary powerless to help." I just stared at him. "Are you deriving some pleasure from this?" "Frankly, a little. For the past 3 days, your father has been telling everyone that his son in the government will clear this up. He seems to believe you're some sort of analyst who can make a few calls and make this disappear. He has no clue that you're the individual who authorized the very investigation that brought him here." The information was a gut punch, but I maintained a neutral facade. "Is that all?" "Just one more thing. When we took him into custody, he asked if we had notified his son. He said, and I'm quoting, 'Alex might not be much, but he's one of you. He can tell you this is all a misunderstanding.'" I closed my eyes, feeling a long-held internal dam finally give way. When we re-entered the lobby, my family descended on me with frantic inquiries. "What was that about? Can you do something? Do you know anyone?" I looked at their faces, hopeful, terrified, and utterly oblivious that the person they were imploring for aid was the same one who had helped orchestrate my father's downfall. "The evidence is substantial," I said, choosing my words with care. "But you can intervene, right?" Mark insisted. "You can get someone on the phone. There will be an arraignment shortly. You need to brace yourselves." Uncle Robert moved closer. "Alex, I realize you're just a..." What is it you do, precisely? Something with data analysis, right? Look, I get that you're not in a position of power, but certainly one of your colleagues has influence. Real influence. The courtroom was full. Espionage cases were a rarity in El Paso, and the local news outlets had picked up the scent. I took a seat in the last row with my family, observing as my father was escorted in, clad in an orange jumpsuit and restraints. He seemed more frail than I remembered, diminished. When his gaze met mine across the gallery, he managed a weak, pleading smile that both shattered my heart and ignited a cold fury within me. The charges were read aloud. Conspiracy to commit espionage, violation of the Espionage Act, conspiracy to transmit national defense information to a foreign government. Each count was punishable by decades of incarceration. My father's counsel entered a not guilty plea and then argued for bail, highlighting his client's military career and deep roots in the community. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, rising to his feet. Mr. Carter is a profound flight risk. The government has proof of his contacts in numerous foreign nations and his access to funds that would enable him to vanish. We request he be remanded without bail. I'll hear the arguments, the judge stated. For the next 20 minutes, the lawyers debated my father's character, his service, his community ties. His defense portrayed him as a patriot who had devoted his life to his country. The prosecution depicted him as a traitor who had sold that same country out for personal gain. Neither side acknowledged that his son was sitting just 30 feet away. Finally, the judge declared a recess to deliberate on the bail issue. As the courtroom began to clear, my family formed a tight circle around me. "This is unbelievable," Mark whispered. "He's not a spy. He's no traitor." "The evidence," I started. "The evidence is flawed," Uncle Robert interrupted sharply. "And you ought to be doing something about it instead of just sitting there. Call your director. Call someone in charge. This is your father." "You think I haven't?" The lie slipped out effortlessly. "Then try again. For God's sake, Alex, what is the use of your government job if you can't even help your own family?" I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw 32 years of belittled accomplishments, unappreciated sacrifices, and casual disdain concentrated in his impatient glare. He was addressing me just as my father always had, as my entire family always had, like I was a boy playing a man's game. "You're right," I said softly. "I'll make a call." I stepped out onto the courthouse steps and took out my phone. Not to place a call. All the important calls had been made, but to check my inbox. There were 17 new messages, among them an email from the deputy director requesting my analysis of the weekend's intelligence digest, and another from a Senate subcommittee asking for my testimony on emerging cybersecurity threats. When I went back inside, my family was huddled in the corridor, whispering urgently. They fell silent as I approached. "Well?" Mark asked. "I talked to my superior," I began, pausing to look at each of their faces. My aunt, who always introduced me as Alex, who works for the government, with computers. My uncle, who had lectured me over Christmas dinner 3 years ago on how the real world operated. My cousins, who had never bothered to ask what something in intelligence actually entailed, as if it were some simple, monolithic task performed by people like me in anonymous cubicles. He said there's nothing that can be done. The evidence is irrefutable. The statement struck them with the force of a physical impact. Mark began to weep. Uncle Robert swore under his breath in Spanish. Aunt Clara started praying her rosary again. But I wasn't done. "Actually," I said, my voice loud enough for them all to hear, "he said one more thing." They looked at me, a flicker of desperate hope in their eyes. "He said my father's case involves matters of national security and is being managed at the highest levels. He said the individual leading the investigation is someone with immense authority." "Who?" Robert demanded. "Can you get in touch with them?" "I already have." The courtroom doors swung open, and people began to return to their seats. As we sat down, I saw my father scanning the gallery for me. He mouthed what appeared to be, "Help me." I mouthed back, "I love you." The judge came back, and a hush fell over the room. After reviewing the evidence and considering the arguments, he began, This court finds that the defendant constitutes a significant flight risk and a danger to national security. Bail is denied. My father's posture sagged. Behind me, Mark sobbed. However, the judge went on, before this court adjourns, I have a somewhat unusual matter to address. The prosecution has requested that a certain individual be recognized for their contribution to this investigation. A cold dread settled in my stomach. This individual's full identity must remain classified, but their efforts in uncovering and investigating Mr. Carter's actions exemplify the highest standard of service to this nation. The prosecutor rose. Your Honor, with the court's leave, I would like to acknowledge the lead investigator whose analysis and oversight were instrumental in building this case. You may proceed. Colonel Alex Carter, United States Army Intelligence and Security Command. The name resonated through the courtroom like a rifle shot. I felt every eye in the room turn to me, my family's bewildered stares feeling like a physical pressure. My father's face drained of all color, his jaw slack as his mouth worked but produced no sound. Colonel Carter, the judge said, his gaze fixed on me. Would you please rise? My legs felt unsteady, but I managed to stand. The silence in the room was absolute. Colonel, on behalf of this court and our nation, I thank you for your service and your commitment to national security, especially under what must be profoundly difficult personal circumstances. I gave a single tight nod, unable to form words. You may be seated. As I sat back down, I could feel my family's eyes on me like hot spotlights. Mark was gaping at me as if I had sprouted horns. Uncle Robert's mouth was agape, and Aunt Clara had fumbled her rosary beads onto the floor. But it was my father's expression that will be seared into my memory forever. It wasn't anger or betrayal, but something far worse. Recognition. The slow, horrifying dawn of understanding that the son he had written off and belittled was the very person who had brought about his ruin. The judge was speaking again, discussing schedules and legal motions, but I didn't hear a word. I was transfixed by my father's face as the gravity of the situation fully descended upon him. As the hearing concluded and he was led out, he glanced back one last time. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and I saw something in his that I had never seen before. Respect. A terrible, belated respect. Outside on the courthouse steps, my family encircled me, a ring of stunned and accusatory faces. You're a colonel? Mark's voice was a faint whisper. Yes. A colonel? In Army Intelligence? Yes. You? You investigated Dad? My office flagged his activities. I recused myself from direct command of the case once he was identified. Uncle Robert was shaking his head in disbelief. You've been deceiving us for years. I've been upholding my security oath. There is a distinction. You let us treat you like you were a nobody, Mark yelled, his voice cracking. You let us think you were just some... You never asked, I interrupted quietly. In 15 years, not one of you ever truly asked what I do. You made an assumption, and I allowed it because it was simpler than explaining the truth to people who wouldn't care. Aunt Clara was crying now. You could have done something. You could have warned him. No, I said, my tone firm. I couldn't have. That would have constituted treason. He's your father. And I am an officer in the United States Army. My allegiance is to the Constitution, not to a family member who sells secrets. The words hung between us, a final, unassailable judgment. Maria wiped tears from her face. So what happens now? You just return to your big, important job and act like this never happened? I looked at her, at all of them, and felt the immense burden of being perpetually underestimated finally lift. No, I replied. Now, I go back to my job and I continue to serve my country. Just as I've always done. Just as I always will. I turned and walked away from them, away from the family that had never managed to see me for who I truly was. As I got to my rental car, I heard Mark call out, "Alex, wait!" I stopped and turned. "I'm sorry," he said, tears flowing freely. We had no idea." "I know," I said, "but that isn't my fault." On the flight back to Maryland, I replayed the look on my father's face in that courtroom. The shock, the recognition, The awful comprehension that his disappointing son had been living a life beyond his wildest imagination while he was betraying his country for money. There was no sense of victory in it, no satisfaction. Only the grim, silent knowledge that sometimes the people who profess to love you the most are the ones who see you the least. My phone vibrated. A text from a number I didn't recognize. My father had somehow found a way. I never knew, it read. I'm so sorry. I looked at the words for a long moment before typing a reply. I know. It was not forgiveness. It was not a reconciliation. It was simply an acknowledgement, the one thing I had craved from him my entire life, delivered 2 decades too late and at the cost of everything we both held dear. But as the aircraft carried me back toward my real life, my real responsibilities, to the world where everyone knew exactly who I was and what I could do, I understood a fundamental truth. I no longer needed their recognition. I had never truly needed it. I had always been precisely who I was meant to be. They simply hadn't bothered to look closely enough to see.